Thus, it is postulated that it is another consciousness which makes them sacred, or which knows and wills them as duties. The first holds to pure duty, indifferent to all specific content, and duty is only this indifference towards such content. The other, however, contains the equally essential relation to doing and to the necessity of the specific content. Since for this other, duties mean specific duties. The content as such is equally essential as the form which makes the content a duty. This consciousness is consequently one in which universal and particular are simply one, and its notion is therefore the same as the notion of the harmony of morality and happiness. For this antithesis equally expresses the separation of the self-equal moral consciousness from that actuality, which as manifold being, conflicts with the simple essential nature of duty. While, however, the first postulate expresses the harmony of morality and nature as a harmony that simply is, because in it nature is the negative aspect of self-consciousness, is the moment of being, this implicit harmony, on the other hand, is now essentially posited as consciousness. For what simply is now has the form of the content of duty, or is the determinateness in the determinate duty. The implicit harmony is thus the unity of what are simple essentialities of thought, and are therefore only in a consciousness. This is then henceforth a master and ruler of the world who brings about the harmony of morality and happiness, and at the same time sanctifies duties in their multiplicity. This last means this much, that for the consciousness of pure duty, the determinate or specific duty cannot straightway be sacred, but because the specific duty, on account of the actual doing, which is a specific action, is likewise necessary, its necessity falls outside of that consciousness into another consciousness, which thus mediates or brings together the specific and the pure duty, and is the reason why the former also has validity. Paragraph 606 picks up with this question that has been raised by the previous paragraphs that I've got here. What makes the multiple duties sacred or holy? Heiligt them. It's a verb that Hegel uses here for making sacred. And why is he raising this question? Well, because we've got this opposition between sort of a pure moral consciousness of duty or Pflicht as such, and then we have a much more reality-based, a wirkliche, way of approaching things, which recognizes that we have a myriad of multiple specific duties that are based on the specific things that we encounter in our lives. What it is that we're actually engaged with. It's never the case that you are doing pure duty in and of itself in the ways in which you act in the real world. So he says, it's postulated. Notice that now we have yet another postulation taking place. That is a placing out in front of ourselves, not with any absolute foundation, but saying, this has to be there, right? It's postulated it is another consciousness which makes them, the multiple duties, sacred, or which knows and wills them as duties. I'm going to fast forward a little bit. Hegel is going to talk at the end of this about a master and ruler of the world, and you might say, okay, well, that's the one who's actually willing and knowing and perhaps even doing. And it's not going to work for the doing of the specific duties. On the other hand, that other consciousness, that is also us as the moral consciousness. So bringing these two together is going to be quite a task. So he says, the first holds to pure duty, right? We've got this moral consciousness that understands pure duty, and he says it's indifferent to all specific content. Duty is duty is duty. Don't worry about the specifics about should the shopkeeper pay his employees well or have a good price simply because he's got this sort of shop, like he's making watches or fixing Apple products or something like that, right? It's not the specific content. He says duty is only this indifference towards such content. Why would duty be indifference towards content? Well, this is something that is particularly important to the very notion of duty. It's supposed to be transferable from domain to domain to domain. So if we have a duty of justice, you can say, it's nice that it has to do with jelly beans over here and watches over here and the amount of time that you're giving to each person on a television program here, but in a certain sense, it doesn't really matter what the justice is about, right? So he goes on and he says, the other consciousness, contains the equally, notice this key term, equally essential relation to doing, to making something happen, to taking these ideals of duty and putting them into reality. And he says, and to the necessity of the specific content. Specific content matters here. So he says, for this other, duties mean specific duties. It does matter whether I'm churning butter or churning out videos. It does matter whether I am helping an old lady across the street or stealing, from the rich to give to the poor, or pick whatever you want, right? So he goes on and he says, for this other, these duties mean specific duties. The content as such is equally essential as the form, which makes the content a duty. Notice the interplay between content and form. The form is that of pure duty, but it's being applied to a particular content, and that matters here very much. So he goes on and he says, this consciousness, now which consciousness is he talking about? Let's follow the text and we'll see, is consequently one in which universal and particular are simply one, and its notion is therefore the same as the notion of the harmony of morality and happiness. So we're dealing with this other consciousness, which we may be tempted to read as simply being the same as this other moral consciousness concerned with the particulars. But it's more complicated than that, because this is a consciousness which is the notion, the begriff, the concept, the dialectical advance in this case, right? And it's connected with this postulated harmony that we've already talked about in the previous paragraphs between morality and happiness. There is a conflict there between morality and happiness. We see many people acting morally who don't wind up being happy. We see many people acting immorally who wind up being quite happy, at least in an earthly, worldly sense of Glück or Glücklichkeit, which is what Hegel has been using here as his term. So he says, here we go. For this antithesis equally expresses the separation of the self-equal, self-equivalent, right? Selbstgleich, moral consciousness from that actuality, which is manifold being, conflicts with the simple, essential nature of duty. So we have this antithesis here between two different moral consciousnesses, which are supposed to be united in one single moral consciousness. One way to understand that is through this postulated harmony. So we've got two postulates in play here, right? And he says, this antithesis equally expresses this separation, right? While, however, the first postulate expresses the harmony of morality and nature as a harmony that simply is, because in it nature is the negative aspect of self-consciousness, is the moment of being. This implicit harmony is, on the other hand, essentially posited as consciousness. And this is well worth dwelling on. When we're talking about these antitheses or contradictions between whether it's conceived of as morality and happiness, morality and nature, the pure will and the conditioned will that has impulses, drives, inclinations, any of those sorts of things, where is this problem posed? Is it out there, you might say, in nature, waiting for us to discover it? No, it's not out there in nature as such, like, discovering how gravity works or any other physical phenomena like that, because it has to do with moral consciousness. It's within us to discover, and it is discovered through human experience and reflection upon that. So on the one hand, it does connect up with the world, or the universe as we might consider it, but it's not something of a world that does not include rational beings as already centers within that world. In a way, you could say that this entire conflict between morality and whatever else it's going to be can only matter for a rational being. So he goes on and he says, what it simply is now has the form of the content of duty, or the determinateness in the determinate duty. So this implicit harmony, he says, is the unity of what are simple essentialities, and therefore are only in a consciousness. Now he brings in this master and ruler of the world. So this is another consciousness. This is the way the other consciousness is being revealed to us. This master and ruler of the world who brings about the harmony of morality and happiness, and at the same time sanctifies duties in their multiplicity. Now, is that us? Are we the master and the, what else? The master and ruler of the world, reconciling these, if not antitheses, certainly oppositions between morality and happiness? No, clearly not, right? We can maybe carry that out in our thought, but a lot of it is going to be sophisms. This is a real problem. This is a genuine issue here. So what is this consciousness that's being postulated as the ruler of the world? Well, Kant thought that you had to assume that the world was set up in such a way that you could postulate a harmony between morality and happiness. He actually uses that as what's called the moral proof of God's existence. So he says, this last, what's the last? Sanctifying duties in their multiplicity means this much, that for the consciousness of pure duty, the determinate or specific duty cannot straightaway be sacred, cannot be sacred just by being a specific duty. It has to be connected back to this conception of duty. There has to be something uniting them. And that's something that, at this point, Hegel doesn't use the word alienation, but we are, in fact, alienated, estranged from this absolute moral consciousness, aren't we? So he says, a specific duty, on account of the actual doing, which is a specific action, is also necessary. So it's not just necessity in the sense of the necessity imposed upon us by pure duty, thou shalt not, sort of abstracted away from any content. I mean, think about the Decalogue as the prime example of this. It doesn't say, listen, I'm God, and I've got one simple rule for you. You will do your duty. People look at me and, what the hell are our duties then? Okay, I know I'm supposed to fulfill them, but can you give me a little hint about what I'm supposed to do? And then you've got some very general, broad outlines that have been debated for, centuries after centuries. Well, just bearing false witness, is that just in a law court, or does that apply to lying in general? Is it okay for me to not tell the truth if I'm not actually outright lying? People get into all sorts of, niceties about this, but that's dealing with more specific content. You might think about the, reevaluation of some of the other commandments, thou shalt not kill or murder, right? And then you get this guy later on saying, well, the law says that, the Decalogue says that, but I'm also saying if you get angry with your brother, you're doing something wrong along those same lines, And so these specific duties, they can become quite vast, can't they? And they're necessary. Hegel says they are necessary. Why? Why do we have to have specific duties? We just have to apply it to something. We need some sort of material in order to make sense out of this pure idea. No, they confront us equally as things incumbent upon us, as a Zolan, you ought to, right? Or in Latin as a debere, or in Greek, de, you must. There is a deontological binding force even with them. So he says, it's necessity. What's necessity? a specific duties necessity, falls outside of that consciousness, the consciousness of pure duty, into another consciousness. Now, which other consciousness? This is the thing to think about. Is it the consciousness of the average person who, well, not even average person, every person insofar as they exist, whether they're a beggar or a king, right? Insofar as they have any real duties in the real world to real persons or about real things, those are specific duties, and they have to treat them as necessary, or they have to break the duty. There's this other consciousness, the ruler of the world, who could do, in fact, what Hegel's talking about, mediating, bringing together the specific and pure duty, and is the reason why the former, the specific, has validity. The question is, do we really, really need to postulate this? Or can we, in fact, become that other without becoming the ruler of the world? Hegel's not actually broaching that question here because he's just following along moral consciousness as it develops. It's going to wind up in a bit of a bind towards the end of this section. But we'll see that coming as we get into the next paragraphs. In the actual doing, however, consciousness behaves as this particular self, as completely individual. It is directed towards reality as such, and has this for its purpose, for it wills to achieve something. Duty in general thus falls outside of it into another being, which is consciousness and the sacred lawgiver of pure duty. For the consciousness which acts, and just because it acts, the validity of the other consciousness, that of pure duty, is directly acknowledged. This pure duty is thus the content of another consciousness, and is sacred for the consciousness that acts only mediately, that is, through the agency of this other consciousness. Here in this short paragraph 607, Hegel is telling us a little bit more about these two consciousnesses that we were discussing in the previous paragraph, one of which here he's actually going to call the sacred lawgiver, Heilige Gesetzgeber, right? Who is essentially God, right? Conceived of as a moral being. And he tells us that in the actual doing, in the Handeln, or comportment, if you like. It's not just a tun, doing an action. It's a particular way of behaving. Consciousness, he says, behaves as this, or it relates itself as this particular self, as completely individual, or as, in other words, like a fulfilled individual, Einzelnes, he says. Now here's a very interesting observation. It's directed at reality as such as its purpose or end or goal. What does that mean? In action, in doing things, whether it's duty-bound or not, we are actually engaging in reality, even if it's an interior reality, like if I'm willing myself to think about some particular matter or to remember where I left my keys. I'm working on reality, and I'm trying to do something. All thinking is, in some sense, practically motivated, if not necessarily practical. There's an end or goal in place. Very often, many complex systems of ends or goals or purposes. And we direct ourselves at reality as an end or goal in two different ways. You can talk about, as Freud did, the reality principle. Man, if you don't take account of the way things actually are, whatever great intentions you have or whatever pipe dreams you have about realizing your pleasures are going to come smack against the the pain and the obstacles and the setbacks that you're going to face, and ultimately death, too. Death and loss. There's that. But there's also this drive to impose something on reality. Reality is almost like a lure that draws us to modify it, to contribute to it. And it's doing both of these at the same time. It's conditioning what we can expect, what we can act upon, and it's also drawing us in to act upon it. So he says it's directed towards reality as such, has this for its purpose. Why? Because it wills to achieve, to produce something. What is it trying to produce? Whatever it is that the specific duty is asking for it. So if it's to save for my children's education, that means that the Handlung must include making some money, not spending that money, finding a safe place to put that money. That's part of the reality that I'm dealing with. And to produce a reality in which that money exists at the end of the day when they're going to college. And we could go on and on with all sorts of other examples. So what about duty in general? What about duty as such? He says it falls outside of it into what? Another being. Now what's this other being? Well, we saw in the previous paragraph there has to be this ruler of the world, that's the notion, that's uniting all these different aspects of moral consciousness, that is, postulating the harmony of nature and morality, or happiness and morality, all this other stuff. Here, Hegel talks in terms of the holy or divine lawgiver, or norm creator, you might say. He says, this is consciousness and the sacred lawgiver of pure duty, the one who is telling us what duty in general consists in. So then he says the consciousness which acts, just because it acts, the validity of the other consciousness, that of pure duty, is directly acknowledged. When we're acting in accordance with duty, we're not saying, I only have these specific duties, screw the general conception of duty. No, we see our fulfilling our specific duties as, in fact, somehow, in some distant way, realizing or participating in this greater capital D duty, this duty in general. So when I, act as a dutiful father and try to save for my kids' college education, I'm not just doing that one thing, although it's very easy to start losing track of that, in which case it no longer becomes a moral duty and just becomes a purely pragmatic thing, right? But I still want to retain that connection to duty as a whole. Or I might think of my duty as a professor to my students, right? Should I actually show up the first day of class prepared to teach and have a syllabus in hand? These are very prosaic duties. And you can say, well, what's going to happen if you don't? Well, I'm not going to prepare my students for a good semester. That's a specific duty that ties in with greater duty. So when we're doing our specific duties, one of the end goals is to actually fulfill duty writ large. Now here's where it gets really interesting. He's got this little offhand remark here. This pure duty is the content of another consciousness. And it's sacred for the consciousness that acts only mediately through the agency of this other consciousness. So we've got another consciousness, other consciousness. What's going on here? Who's acting mediately? Well, in a certain way, both of them are acting mediately, but one of them is being referred to here as acting mediately. The sacred lawgiver doesn't act directly within the cosmos, within reality. The sacred lawgiver acts through each of us fulfilling our specific duties. At the same time, our specific duties are duties by participating or in some way expressing or being connected to this broader conception of duty. And we need both sides of this. We can't reduce one to the other, although people have often tried in their reconstructions of morality.